Have you ever had a player at your table who was so aggressive you knew that they couldn't possibly always have a strong hand, but you weren't sure how to actually fight back? We've all been in that situation at some point, so if you want to know how to react next time it happens, this video is for you. Hi Wizards, I'm Matt Hunt, and this video is all about battling the maniacs. Those players at your table who give you nightmares with their continued insistence on always playing aggressively no matter what, and seemingly never backing down when you do fight back. We're going to focus primarily on MTTs, but the principles we're discussing will also be relevant for cash games, especially when we look at some deeper stacked adjustments. Let's start by defining what we mean by a maniac, at least in strategic terms. What we're really focusing on is players whose overall aggression levels are far too high across all parts of the game tree, and who will generally be putting in far too much betting volume as a whole. This means not only betting too often, but also betting too big in certain spots where small bets are much more effective. In addition, we're also going to assume that our maniac is prone to underfolding to our aggression on the earlier streets. In other words, we're going to assume that they're not just automatically backing down as soon as we show any aggression ourselves. After all, if they were betting at a high frequency but then overfolding to raises, they wouldn't be anywhere near as difficult to play against. Finally, we're also going to assume that their betting ranges are somewhat too merged in many situations. This essentially means they'll be taking a lot of middle-strength hands and betting them in situations where they're not functioning clearly as value bets or bluffs. Now, one caveat here is that while GTO Wizard AI will give us a great level of insight into how we should approach these players, we're not easily going to be able to account for predicting our opponent's aggression levels on future streets. For the most part, we're going to stick to exploring our options in ways which we can do quickly and efficiently using the AI, as opposed to running sims which might take hours or even days to complete. So let's meet our subject for this video, our archetypal maniac player profile. Wizards, this is Steve. Steve is 25 years old, although this photo maybe looks a little older than that, from the USA, and Steve is what we would call a trust fund kid. Steve's parents are billionaires, and he loves gambling with his parents' money. Steve doesn't care about winning and losing. He knows he's probably not a winning poker player, but that doesn't bother him. Steve loves the game, and he particularly loves winning big pots, showing down big bluffs, and putting his opponents in nightmare spots. For this reason, he will always bet if you check to him, no matter what, and he never bets less than half pot. Steve's least favorite thing to do at the poker table is folding. It takes a lot of effort to make Steve fold any kind of draw, and if he has a pair, he's not going to fold it unless you're betting at least 2 times the pot. So what's our pathway to maximizing our EV against Steve? Well, it all starts pre-flop, and we can explore it using GTO Wizard AI's heads-up pre-flop solver. Even though we're not necessarily going to be playing heads-up against Steve, simplifying the game can help us get a pretty good idea of the general principles we'll need to obey if we're going to maximize our EV against him. The general approach we're going to take when heads up against Steve is designed to help us figure out our overall exploitative framework for playing against him and establish where our additional EV is coming from. When playing against him in a full ring or 6-max environment, we're obviously not going to be able to use the same ranges as we would when heads up, but we will be able to use the same overall approach to extracting more EV from Steve, so our strategies will translate fairly well. We'll begin by assuming we're deep stacked at around 200 big blinds. We're not incorporating an ante, but that doesn't matter since we're just looking at the principles here. We'll imagine Steve is the in-position player pre-flop, and he's going to open to 3 big blinds on the button. Let's see how our 3-bet strategy from out of position is going to change depending on exactly how wide Steve's opening range is. This will give us a sense of how the width of an opening range is going to alter our defense strategy, even when villain is opening larger and wider than what would be optimal. I've allowed us a set of 6 potential 3-bet sizes here, everywhere from 3 times the open size all the way up to 8 times. Our goal here is to look at how the width of the opening range affects our 3-bet strategy against this large open size, so that we can get a baseline idea of what we should do at deep stacks when our opponent is both opening wider and larger than what would be optimal. This graphic shows us how our use of each of the sizes alters as the width of the opening range changes, with the opening frequency on the left from 25 up to 100%, and our total 3-bet frequency in the last column on the right, with the distribution in each of the other columns. It's obvious that our 3-bet frequency is going to go up as the opening range gets wider, but the most interesting part of this graphic is that there's a heavy shift toward the smaller sizings as well. Now here's the same information in chart form. You can see the changes in the distribution of our sizes a little better here. Against the tighter opening range, there's no clear trend in 3-bet sizing, but as the range gets wider, there's a clear preference for the smaller sizes of 9 big blinds and 12 big blinds, since villain has a lot more very weak hands which can't continue even versus a smaller 3-bet. So it would seem that against players who open too wide, we should 3-bet slightly smaller, right? Well, actually it's not that simple, because the player profile we're talking about here isn't just opening too wide. They're also underfolding versus our 3-bets and probably 4-betting too much as well. So let's go step by step and figure out what the best course of action is versus that specific type of player. First, let's look at an extreme example. What if our opponent Steve never folds to a 3-bet at all? We can simulate this by simply removing the folding option from his side of the game tree and doing the same calculations we did before. That gives us this grid, which looks very different to the earlier one. You'll notice that there's no point in showing this grid in chart form, because if we know our opponent isn't folding, there's no reason to 3-bet to any size other than the biggest one available. Every frequency between 9 big blinds and 21 big blinds is 0 here. At 200 big blinds, we're probably too deep to just simply jam all in, but later on we'll look at the 50 big blind stack size, and things will be very different there. I did the same thing for an in-position spot with the game tree tweaked to have us limp 100% of hands and villain raise 100%, and got more or less the same results. Here are the two strategies side by side. As you can see, if villain opens any 2 cards and never folds to our 3-bet, not only are we choosing the biggest 3-bet size available, but our 3-bet range also becomes entirely linear. There are no bluffs in this range at all, or at least there's no element of polarization to it. We're essentially 3-betting so wide for value that even some of the hands which would usually be classed as bluffs are now value raises, like pocket 3s, jack 8 suited, or ace 7 off. Why does this strategy look the way it does? To answer that question, we have to look at Steve's response here, which is going to lead us down another rabbit hole. As you can see here, when we force Steve to open any 2 cards and never fold to a 3-bet, his response is extremely passive. What's happening here is that most of the hands which Steve should be folding are weak enough that they can't ever justify 4-betting, so he has to just call with them. But if he calls all those hands, the EV of his entire calling range will be much lower. So the solver is trying to compensate by adding more strong hands to his calling range, essentially forcing him to trap at a much higher rate. This is a phenomenon I like to refer to as the "please don't make me play bad" effect. We're forcing the solver to do something which is clearly a bad idea, opening any 2 cards and never folding to a 3-bet, so it's going to try to compensate in any way it can in order to minimize losses. In this case, the best way for it to do that is to rarely 4-bet and trap with most of the strong hands to strengthen the flatting range. The only hands that do have the incentive to 4-bet here are now the middling to strong ones, which want to get more money in the pot pre-flop but aren't very good at realizing equity post-flop. Mostly the middle and lower pocket pairs and the strongest offsuit aces. Those hands simply want to jam all in, to put as many of our hands in a tough spot as possible, since a lot of our range is flipping against those hands here. So in the end, Steve's best response if he's not allowed to fold is to almost always call, but sometimes just shove all in for 200 big blinds. The fact that he's never 4-betting to a smaller size here is directly allowing us to 3-bet a completely linear range. This is why our strategy of 3-betting larger and more linear looks the way it does. We get maximum value from his extremely weak calling range, and we don't get 4-bet much at all. But what if Steve plays a completely different strategy? What if Steve plays a strategy where he never shoves all in, but 4-bets to something like 3 times our 3-bet size? Would we still prefer our strategy of 3-betting to a large size with a linear range? Well, the short answer is yes, as this graphic shows. The main reason for this is because even when Steve is not allowed to shove all in, his strategy of never folding still requires him to trap a lot and rarely 4-bet. So his calling frequency versus the 3-bet is still around 95%, and we don't have to worry about being put in an awkward position versus a 4-bet. Our next step, therefore, is to think about what our strategy will look like if Steve is going to 4-bet more frequently, which, since he's a maniac, we should probably expect to happen in practice. GTO Wizard AI's node locking feature allows us to do this very neatly, since we can simply use the sliders to increase Steve's 4-bet frequency, and the solver will automatically pick the best hands for him to do it with, based on the EV of those hands as 4-bets. This next graphic shows how our 3-bet frequency changes as we alter Steve's 4-bet frequency, with our 3-bet frequency on the y-axis and his 4-bets on the x-axis. Interestingly, there's not a massive change one way or the other, only a few percent either way, with some slight increases and decreases based on how wide Steve's 4-bet for value range becomes. Even if Steve is 4-betting 40% of the time, which is almost 10 times as often as he's supposed to, we're still only decreasing our 3-bet frequency by about 3%. Why is this? Well, it has to do with the construction of Steve's 4-bet range, as you'll see in a moment. But first, let's take a glance at our strategy versus the 4-bet itself. Evidently, we're doing a lot of shoving all in versus this 4-bet, which makes a lot of sense given that he's 4-betting to a large size of 3 times our 3-bet, and we're getting a good price to be all in and realize our equity. But the other interesting thing here is that as soon as Steve is 4-betting more often than the optimal frequency of around 5% here, we no longer have any folds against that 4-bet. This could be a very important part of our strategy against maniacs. It's telling us that if we already know a player is likely to 4-bet too aggressively, it might be a big mistake to have any 3-bet folds at all. However, the big factor here is the construction of Steve's 4-bet range, as I mentioned a moment ago. This next image shows us an example of how Steve's 4-bet range was constructed when I used the slider to give him a 40% 4-bet frequency. It obviously looks pretty weird, but in a general sense, you can see that it's a polarized range. It has a lot of pocket pairs and strong offsuit ace-x hands for value, while the bluffing region is anchored around a lot of the very weakest offsuit hands, with the queen deuce off to 8 deuce off region 4-betting in pure. The fact that our 3-bet frequency didn't change very much overall is largely down to this factor. When Steve is 4-betting a polar range, he still mostly has fairly clear decisions against our 4-bet jam, calling with his value and folding his bluffs. And we still have some fairly awkward spots with the thin value portion of our 3-betting range, which doesn't really want to get it in, but also doesn't want to fold to a 4-bet. In general, 4-betting a polar range from in position, especially for the big size that Steve has chosen, would be a fairly good decision for Steve here, even though the fact that he's never folding is obviously already costing him a lot of EV. But the difficult thing for us here is that a lot of these maniacs don't 4-bet with polar ranges. They tend to take an approach primarily based on the strength of their hand and don't often consider the possibility of a difficult spot against future aggression, or what happens if their opponent shoves all in. They simply tend to put more money in the pot when they think there's a good chance they have the best hand. So with that in mind, let's examine what happens if we make Steve's 4-bet range a much more linear one instead. This is what it looks like when we have Steve 4-betting more linearly. This is the most extreme version where he's 4-betting the top 40% of the deck and calling everything else. I had to select these hands manually since the slider in the node lock menu makes decisions according to EV as opposed to basic hand strength. And here's what it does to our frequencies. There's a much more obvious change in our 3-bet strategy here to begin with. The less often Steve is 4-betting, the more often we can 3-bet, with a slight reversal once his 4-bet frequency becomes extremely high. There's about a 14% gap between our aggression when he 4-bets 5% of the time and when he 4-bets 40% of the time, which is far more significant than what we saw before. To figure out why this is happening, we also have to look at our responses to the 4-bet once it does occur. Now, looking at the distribution of our frequencies here, this is where things get really interesting. When Steve is 4-betting a very tight and strong top 5% range, we respond with no calls and purely an all-in or fold strategy. Our hand is either strong enough to get it all in against his 4-bet range, or it doesn't benefit from putting any more chips in the pot at all. Remember also that we were 3-betting more often in this scenario to begin with as well. On the other end of the scale, when he's 4-betting extremely aggressively in a linear fashion, we already know our initial 3-bet frequency has decreased by about 14% from the previous graph, and now we're seeing that we never fold to the 4-bet at all. In fact, we mostly shove all in, with only certain specific hands benefiting from calling, given the awkward price that we're getting and the low post-flop SPR. So before we go any further, let's just take a beat to recap where we're at and summarize what we've figured out so far. We've established that Steve never folds to our 3-bet, which means we have a significant incentive to 3-bet larger and more linear in our construction. In order to compensate for never folding to our 3-bet, Steve should be 4-betting very rarely, and protecting his extremely wide flatting range by trapping with his strong hands. But it's probably reasonable to assume he's not doing that. Depending on our exact read on what Steve is doing, we might have more than one plausible option in how we adjust to exploit him. If he's 4-betting too much, which we've already established is likely since he's a maniac, but he's doing it with a polarized 4-bet range, then our initial 3-bet strategy doesn't really change. We still have a big incentive to 3-bet larger and more linear to take advantage of his lack of folding. Depending on our exact read on what Steve is doing, we might have more than one plausible option in how we adjust to exploit him. If he's 4-betting too much, which we've already established is likely since he's a maniac, but he's doing it with a polarized 4-bet range, then our initial 3-bet strategy doesn't really change very much. We still have a big incentive to 3-bet larger and more linear to take advantage of his lack of folding, but the main difference now is that we simply stop folding to his 4-bet since it contains a lot of extremely weak bluffs which are doing very poorly against our linear 3-bet range. However, if Steve is 4-betting too aggressively and doing it with a linear range, we would have to start 3-betting a tighter range, but 5-bet jamming more often when we do 3-bet. The goal of this being to put Steve in as many difficult spots as possible when he 4-bets with a thin value type hand, which would usually just call our 3-bet. Eventually, our strategy will reach a point where we have no incentive to ever fold to his 4-bet. We'll either be 5-bet jamming or simply peeling the 4-bet given the price we're getting. The reason for this is that as his linear 4-bet range expands wider and wider, it becomes so wide that it becomes a little easier for us to sometimes call the 4-bet and play post-flop. Against a tight linear range, though, we would have very little reason to call the 4-bet and try to navigate on future streets. But all this is making the assumption that Steve never folds to the 3-bet at all. And that might be a little unrealistic. What if he does fold sometimes? There are a few questions which we need to answer here. The first one is, do our linear 3-bets gain anything from him folding? After all, a linear 3-bet range is 3-betting for thin value, and if we're getting folds, we're losing a little bit of that value. Although we're also denying him the ability to realize equity at the same rate, so the trade-off could be worth it. The next question is, how does his folding frequency affect our 3-bet range? Do we start altering our construction as he begins folding more, or does our range simply expand and contract? Well, in order to answer any of these questions, we have to start normalizing his 4-bet frequency, because if we don't, the solver will want him to compensate for folding more by altering his 4-bet range and frequency, and that will throw off all of our results. This graphic shows us the results of tweaking Steve's folding frequency with a consistent linear 10% 4-bet frequency and a shifting calling frequency. It's worth noting in this instance that we had Steve 4-betting to a sizing much larger than what GTO would prefer, which is why you can see in the right-hand column that our GTO frequency for calling the 4-bet, in this case, would be only around 1%. These numbers are much more easily interpreted in graph form though, so let's view them that way. This is what our graph looks like for this spot. On the far left, we have our strategy for if Steve is only folding 10% of the time, and on the far right, we have the GTO strategy, where Steve is folding at the optimal frequency for a 3 big blind any 2 cards open, which would be around 77% given the large sizing of our 3-bet. As you can tell from the graph, our strategy on the left is more evenly distributed, with more 3-betting and more folding. While as we get closer and closer to Steve playing a GTO strategy, we start 3-betting less, calling more, and folding slightly less as well. This might all be difficult to interpret, so what's actually happening here? Well, it's a few things. First, we know Steve is underfolding to 3-bets, so we know he's folding less than the 77% of the time he should be in GTO, given that he opened with any 2 cards for 3 big blinds. The more Steve starts to fold to our 3-bet, the less we have to gain by 3-betting for thin value with certain hands which are on the edge of our value range. This causes these hands to shift towards calling instead. This in turn actually strengthens our calling range because we're adding in some hands at the top of the range. Consequently, this actually allows us to start calling slightly wider at the bottom of the range because those weaker hands are now slightly more protected. As we start 3-betting more for thin value, we also have to now fold the bottom of our calling range because the fact that our calling range is weaker overall means that the weakest hands in this range can no longer call profitably. When it comes to our response against a 4-bet, nothing is changing there. Steve's 4-bet strategy stayed consistent throughout these examples, so the exact hands which call or 5-bet against a 4-bet have not changed either. If he's playing a fixed strategy, then we should also play a fixed strategy. So let's develop a full picture of Steve's overall pre-flop game and allow us to arrive at a final conclusion. We think Steve is raising to 3 big blinds with any 2 cards pre-flop. We also believe he's 4-betting a linear 10% range consisting of the top 10% of hands. We also think that he's probably only folding to 3-bets around 20% of the time, and we don't think he's ever going to fold to a shove after he 4-bets. Obviously, we don't have any proof of any of this, but these are our reads based on what we've seen of Steve at our table. What do we think our final strategy is going to look like? Feel free to pause the video and take a guess or write down some aspects of our strategy if you like. Well, this is our first snapshot of our 200 big blind strategy against Steve from out of position. We're 3-betting to that very large 8x size with the range you can see on the left and calling quite wide as well, although not quite every suited hand in the deck. Against Steve's 4-bet range, you can see our strategy on the right. We're 5-bet jamming with 9s plus and ace-queen and calling with a few other hands, but because he's 4-betting to a large sizing with a fairly linear and strong range, we're not peeling very often here. If we switch the positions and create a game tree which allows us to be in position, things look much the same. Except now, our thin value range has become much wider, and we're now never folding a suited hand to a raise. Obviously, this is because we're playing in position heads up. We shouldn't do this in a full ring context. From in position versus the 4-bet, we're calling more or less the same range, with some very slight tweaks to our approach based on the slightly different price we're getting, which is a product of me needing to manufacture a heads up in position spot for us. You can see that our 5-bet jam range is basically the same though, which is highlighting the fact that when it comes to heads up all-in ranges, position isn't really relevant because we're not going to make any post-flop decisions after we're already all in. To look at things by the numbers, we can see on the left here the two strategies versus the initial open. We're going much wider from in position, as you can see, 48.6% compared to 28.7% with our 3-bet frequency, and we're folding a lot less often from in position, which of course is very natural. On the right, we have our strategies versus the 4-bet itself. Since we're 3-betting a lot wider to begin with, we're going to be folding a lot more often in relative terms. And you can see that we're 3-bet folding around 550 combos instead of only 280 combos. Note, however, that our 5-bet jam range is almost exactly the same in each case. 66.01 combos compared to 66.81. Once again, this is because Steve's strategy is fixed. He's calling off with the same hands and 4-betting with the same hands, so we're 5-bet jamming the same hands. Our calling range does shift slightly, but it's not easy to establish exactly why we would be calling less often from in position. Most likely it's caused by the slightly different prices on offer in the game tree that I had to construct to mimic an in position spot. Our next area of investigation is to think about what we might do if the effective stacks in play are much shallower. For example, at 50 big blinds instead of 200 big blinds. At this depth, it's a lot more difficult for us to use a larger 3-bet size, since we're much closer to simply being forced all in, and it might not be feasible to 3-bet a big chunk of our stack. We're also now at a depth where Steve's 4-bets will always be all in. We're not going to have to think about a 5-bet jamming range here. This might affect our strategy in some interesting ways. Steve's approach is also going to change slightly. We think he would now be willing to 4-bet jam with 20% of hands instead of 10, given that he's risking fewer chips, and we think his range for calling an all-in would be more or less the same set of hands. He's figured out what range he's willing to play for stacks with, and he's determined to play for stacks with those hands. This is what our GTO strategy looks like against his any 2 cards 3 big blinds open at 50 big blinds. Again, in a heads-up context, and this time with a 12 big blind 3-bet size, so 4 times the open. We're doing a surprising amount of jamming with low pairs, offsuit aces, and even some middling suited hands. In fact, this range looks a lot like a range for jamming 25 to 30 big blinds over a button open in an MTT, which is not a coincidence. This spot is actually very similar to that one if you look at the amount that we're risking relative to the pot. Our non-all-in 3-bet range is very polar, with a fairly wide value region and a mostly offsuit, high card, low card bluff region. Against this 4-bet jam, we're calling off as wide as Jack-9 suited, 6-5 suited, King-Jack offsuit, and we're obviously folding all of our 3-bet bluffs. If we engineer the same spot from in position, everything looks very similar except for the fact that our value 3-bet region is narrower and we're no longer jamming anything, since calling has so much more value when we're in position post-flop. Our 3-bet call-off region is not quite as wide, since we're now preferring to call and realize equity in position with many hands which were previously preferring to just get it in pre-flop. These are the numbers. We're obviously folding much less often if we're in position, although that's partially a product of the game tree parameters we had to use, as I mentioned. Our call-off range versus the jam is staying relatively consistent, although it is reducing by about 30 combos, again for the reasons we've already stated. If we apply what we already know about Steve's overall pre-flop game to the shallower stack size, these are the strategies we end up with. A very aggressive out-of-position approach which contains a lot of jams, and a very wide 3-bet call-off range to counter the fact that Steve is 4-bet jamming 20% of hands. We actually have very few 3-bet folds here, as you can see on the right, and only a few of those are taking that line at full frequency. From in position, the fact that Steve's pre-flop range is any 2 cards gives us a relatively straightforward response. We're almost never jamming anything except for pocket 3s about half the time, and we're calling most of the deck. We're very rarely 3-bet folding, and our 3-bet for value range is very wide since we're extracting so much thin value from all the times Steve raise calls the 3-bet. In terms of the numbers, it's much the same as what you'd expect. Much more calling from in position with no jamming and less 3-betting, while the only reason our 3-bet call-off range goes from around 280 combos from out of position to roughly 230 from in position is because certain hands are no longer 3-betting. they prefer to call and play in position as we saw before. Hands like pocket fours, queen 9 suited, and king 10 off are 3-betting pre-flop with the intent to call off when they're out of position, but when they're in position, they have a big incentive to just call and keep all of Steve's worst hands in his range. So to summarize our overall pre-flop approach against Steve in a way which would be applicable even in a full ring environment, we know for sure that we have a significant incentive to 3-bet much larger and much more linearly for thin value if he's not going to be folding much. That's our primary adjustment. When we're very deep stacked, there are many hands which like to 3-bet pre-flop from in position as part of our wider linear range, but then simply fold if we get 4-bet. If Steve's 4-bet remains relatively static and he's playing a fixed strategy where he doesn't adapt to our frequencies, then we can do the same, and simply 3-bet for thin value against his calls while folding a bit more against his 4-bets. However, if he 4-bets a very high frequency, we may start to simply 5-bet jam a lot more as we saw before. Once we get a little shallower, we're going to be more inclined to start jamming pre-flop from out of position since we aren't going to be able to realize equity very easily from out of position, even when his opening range is extremely wide. The hands which are at the top of our potential flatting range against his open will actually start to prefer to 3-bet call off instead of just calling and having to play out of position against a very wide range which can check back a lot of flops and realize some equity. From in position, we're going to be a lot more content to call at shallower stacks while still continuing to 3-bet fairly wide and linearly, being very willing to call it off if we get jammed on, since Steve's 4-bet jamming range will be wider. Finally, if we were playing short-stacked against Steve, for example in an MTT scenario, we would be shoving a lot more often both from out of position and in position. However, it's a little more difficult to estimate exactly how wide our ranges would get, since ICM would most likely be a factor at various stages of the tournament, and we would have to balance our desire to exploit Steve specifically against our priorities in the overall event that we're playing. So now that we've taken a thorough look at how we might adjust to Steve pre-flop, let's see what kinds of post-flop adjustments we might consider making. First, let's consider a somewhat deep-stacked 3-bet pot scenario where we 3-bet a linear range from the blinds against a middle position open from Steve, and he calls. So here is our setup on GTO Wizard AI. If we want to look at the setup briefly, I've got a situation with about 100 big blind effective stacks. Steve opens, we 3-bet quite large, about 5x the open size here, and we get a flop of Queen Jack 4. I've given us a completely linear 3-bet range here, as you can see, just a lot of Broadway hands, good pairs, and some good aces. And I've given Steve a very, very wide range. If we look at all these hands over here, it's a range that is basically just completely capped pre-flop. Low pairs, offsuit aces, every single suited hand, and then maybe, he's 4-betting a lot of these strong hands at very high frequencies. So clearly, when we get this Queen Jack 4 flop, we have a massive nut advantage. Best hands 50.3%, good hands 44.3%, 2.1, 10.4%. Our overall equity is 72% roughly. So it's a great spot for us here. This is extremely favorable considering how wide Steve's range is. And of course, as a byproduct of that, it's going to become a range bet spot for us. Solver wants to bet 100% of the time here. However, range betting would be fine here, but it might not necessarily be the highest EV option for us. If we look at what happens after we check, Steve's range is so weak that he is actually only supposed to bet about 5% of the time. But that's not happening. We've already established that Steve is likely going to bet every single hand when we check to him. So what we can do is we can actually delete the checking option from his side of the tree, which I think is always kind of an interesting thing to do, and say, okay, well, what happens if we force him to bet? We're not necessarily going to decide on his size for him. We're just going to give him, let's say, 4 different bet sizing options plus an all-in, and give him the option to just jam. And we're not going to say what size he has to bet. We're just going to tell him, you cannot check. He does not have the option to check anymore. And as you can see, there's kind of a split between all-in with certain hands, mostly I think flush draws and straight draws, and then basically betting 50% half pot with the rest of the range. And as a result, our frequency for betting on the flop here has gone all the way down to 0. So we've gone from range bet to range check. And that's simply a byproduct of a baseline understanding of the fact that Steve is making so many errors when we check the flop. The EV of us checking the flop has gone astronomically up, and we are massively benefiting now from just allowing him to make that significant mistake. On top of that, not only are we now checking our entire range, but if he bets this half pot size of 18, we are now literally check jamming our entire range here. If we look at what the EVs are of some of these hands, even check jamming a hand like Ace-8 of spades here, which has such little equity, doesn't really have any way to improve very easily here. We're going to have so much fold equity here that we're actually making about 35 to 40% of the pot here, maybe even more than that, depending on which exact combo we have, by check jamming Ace-8 here. So it's just a byproduct of him putting in so much money with so many trashy hands here. It's actually very easy and plausible for us to just check jam every single hand. Now, we haven't locked what he's calling off with, and maybe we should, because this solver is going to want him to fold a lot of hands here because he's not going to be getting a good price. But let's say he bets with any pair, and let's say he's never going to fold any pair or draw. So we've tweaked the game tree here just to make it easy for us to check and then him to range bet. And against the check jam, we're going to have him call with any pair and basically any, let's say 8-out straight draw or better. So we're just going to put all of that on 0. And then I'm going to go through the categories: sets, 2 pairs, top pairs, second pairs, third pairs, low pairs, combo draws, flush draws, and open-enders. And that's going to be the range of hands that he's going to call off with. So we're going to hit lock all, force him to play this way with everything. And let's see if our strategy changes at all here. We are now, nope, we're still check jamming everything. And we're not going back to the flop and deciding to bet everything again either. We're not going to shift our strategy around really there. EV-wise, we're losing a tiny bit. Well, actually, we're losing a fair amount compared to before when he never folds any of these draws and never folds a pair. With hands like Ace-8, we're now only making about 20% of the pot, 22% of the pot. But we're now absolutely just printing to a ridiculous degree, even with hands like King-Jack. King-Jack of spades here just wins almost 90% of the pot, 86% of the pot. So absolutely massive, massive profit margins with these hands. So just getting it in on the earlier streets with a higher equity range than he has is really helping us here. Massive spot for us. Very interesting spot, but a good guideline to, even if a spot is a range bet in theory, the mistakes he's making from in position make it such that we probably don't want to do that. To summarize the spot we just looked at, it was a spot where we could easily range bet if we wanted, given how much equity we had. However, that doesn't fully capture all the EV available to us. After all, we know that Steve never checks back the flop if we check to him, and he always bets at least half pot, so it benefits us a lot to let him do that. This adjustment causes us to want to range check the flop, and based on Steve's overall tendencies facing a potential check jam from our range here at this low SPR, our best approach is actually to check jam our entire range. It seems like a bit of a crazy adjustment here, but if your opponent really does bet the flop with every single hand in their range here, and their range is that wide, then this is the best adjustment to make, especially when their range is as wide as Steve's. Our next spot is going to be an in-position single-raise pot where we open pre-flop and Steve defends the big blind. We'll be a little shallower here at around 50 big blinds, so this might be very applicable to a lot of MTT spots. So this is the spot we're looking at, 50 big blinds, MTT spot. I have given Steve a very, very wide range where he is 3-betting that top 20, 25%-ish, and then just never folding any other hand. So he's literally ever folding to our raise pre-flop. Clearly, on this 10-9-4 2 spades board, we have a massive nut advantage now, which of course is really favorable for us. And it's resulted in a strategy where if I give us 3-bet size options here just to see if there's any kind of mixed strategy going on, we basically are favoring a catch-all size of 75%. And there is a tiny bit of 200% here, but we're not really going to need to use that very much. Now, of course, we haven't made any assumptions yet about Steve's strategy. So let's now take the node locking function and double his check raising frequency in every spot. We're just going to, instead of 14, we're going to put 28 versus the small bet here. So we're going to lock everything there. And then we're going to look at the frequency against the catch-all size, the 75% size. And we're going to take that frequency and lock it at 18% instead of 9%. So once again, he is check raising twice as much as he should. And then we're going to take this 200% size, which of course is a huge overbet. And instead of having him get it in with 13% frequency, we're going to have him get it in 26% of the time. Let's see what that does to our overall strategy. And bear in mind, we haven't tweaked his ranges very specifically here. We haven't tweaked his continuance through a call. All we've done is just accounted for the fact that he's raising a lot more. Let's take a look. Now, things have changed quite dramatically. We're getting to a point where with our value region, we are betting big, we are shoveling money in. Our value region of this portion of hands, our strongest combo draws, the Broadway spades, overpairs, any strong 10, 9s, 4s, all of that stuff wants to shovel money into this pot. By contrast, a lot of other hands want to get a bit of money in there because they have pretty decent equity, and maybe they want to call a raise, maybe they want to 3-bet versus a raise, but they're not necessarily looking to just immediately shovel that money in. Also noteworthy that 10-9 is in there, which is kind of interesting. It could be a blocker factor that's creating that possibly. But the other interesting thing is the 75% size has disappeared now because it's not necessarily favoring the top of our range. It's not necessarily favoring the bottom of our range. Top of our range just wants to bet really big. Everything else wants to either bet small or, as you can see now, check. There's about 38% check frequency here, which is quite high. And it is putting us in a spot where a lot of these 9x hands are going to want to check back the flop. A lot of ace highs, a lot of pocket pairs. So quite obviously, there are quite a lot of hands now which are benefiting from the fact that we now have the option to check behind in position instead of facing a check raise twice as often as we're supposed to. So against a player like Steve, who is a complete maniac, check raising way too often, in position, we really benefit from simply checking back and realizing equity here, as opposed to growing the pot and having to decide what to do against a check raise. Of course, the flip side of that is when we actually have value, we want to get money in. When we have high equity draws, we want to get big money in. And of course, Steve is playing a fixed strategy. He's not going to exploit us. He's not going to adapt to us. So we're just looking to get him to shovel in, create the biggest pot that we possibly can. So we saw here that the flop is a range bet at equilibrium, considering the very wide range that Steve is defending here. But Steve's overall tendency to check raise too often increases the value of checking back for us. Now, while we can't account for Steve potentially over-bluffing the turn after we check, we can make some broad assumptions that most of our middle strength hands are going to realize equity more effectively after checking back than after betting and calling a raise from Steve. However, it's not easy to establish exactly where our threshold should be here, since depending on the exact flop bet and raise sizings we use for our game tree, the ideal response from Steve is going to shift around. And the extent to which certain hands increase or decrease in EV as a bet will also change. In order to make this spot a little simpler and make sure we capture the most EV possible, we can start by focusing on the top of our range, since that's where the majority of our EV comes from in any given spot. In this case, our strongest hands wanted to shovel as much money in as possible and take advantage of Steve's overall level of aggression. The hands which do prioritize checking back or betting smaller will be the ones which really don't want to get raised or create bigger pots, and that's going to be a lot of middling and weaker hands. And again, if Steve is playing a fixed strategy, he's not adapting to us, we're not going to get exploited for that. Lastly, now let's look at a spot when we're defending against Steve's open, and this time we're going to be the one out of position at the same 50 big blind stack size. So this is our last spot. In this case, we've got a 6-5-4 rainbow flop, and as you can see, I've given very wide range to Steve. I've given him any 2 cards, and our range is a little bit wider than what you might expect against the 3x open here, but I've kind of tried to hedge a little bit between a tighter range because of the larger open versus also a range that looks a little bit more like a traditional defending range, except we are 3-betting a very linear range against Steve here, so I've taken out a lot of the strongest hands. Now, this would be a spot that would create some leading at equilibrium, and when I ran this completely unlocked, we did see about 40% donk betting here from the big blind. But I've forced big blind to check, and I've also forced button to c-bet any 2 cards with 50% size. So we can tell that, Steve is still range betting. He's still doing exactly what he did before. In response, I've given us 2 check raise sizes. And what's really interesting is that we do use both of them quite a lot. We actually have a very, very split response here. But in particular, there's something noteworthy about the difference between the 2 sizes. If we hone in on the all-in size, we can see that it's a lot of top pair. It's a lot of pair plus gut shot. It's a lot of pair plus open-ender. And if we hone in on the smaller raise size, the non-all-in raise size, you can see that sets 8-7 and maybe some gut shots, some weaker bluffs, some straights like the deuce 3, those hands are populating this range a little bit more. If we look at the breakdown to see the Manhattan graph, you can kind of see this a little bit better. You can see to some degree up here that the very, very top of the range is populated a little bit more. If I just highlight it here with populated a little bit more with the very, very strongest stuff. And the bulk of the stuff just below that is vulnerable enough that it doesn't really want to play more streets, but it also does have enough equity to check jam. Then you've got chunks like this over here. You've got this chunk over here. And you've got little bits and pieces of some pretty weak hands actually down here. But in general, you can kind of see that there's two very distinct raise sizes emerging here as part of our strategy. And if we lock in what we think Steve is going to do against each of these sizes, hopefully we will see it become an even more pronounced difference between the two approaches. So if we lock in by saying, well, Steve is never folding, let's say, top pair plus, maybe we don't really know what he'll do with second pair, so we'll keep that open. We'll also say we know he's never folding an open-ender. But beyond that, we're just going to kind of let him make his own decisions at this point. We're not going to lock every single hand, but we are going to lock a lot of them. And then when it comes to the more moderate check raise size, we're going to lock his response there by saying we think that he's going to raise all in with, let's say, all of his top pair plus and all of his open-enders, same sort of a thing. And then from that point onwards, we're going to once again keep things unlocked, and we're not going to necessarily force him to play a certain way. We're just going to say we have a pretty decent idea that he's going to be willing to get it in very wide. And let's see what our strategy looks like as a byproduct. So we're now going to lock Steve's response against the more moderate raise size. And in this case, what we're going to do is assume that he gets it in with a lot of hands, of course, gets it in with his top pair plus and all of that stuff. And then we're also going to assume that he has a certain region where he responds very passively. Third pair, second pair, low pair, he's just going to call. Gut shots, he's going to call, and so on. So that, I think, is going to alter our response a little bit. Just put the raise back in there in the overpair and top pair categories. So now we've got this response where he's actually being quite passive in a lot of ways. And if I just put all of this stuff over here on fold, because the sim does want him to actually call at least a little bit with some of these backdoor hands, we now have all of his range locked in. And if we have two different responses against these two different sizes for him here, let's see how our range is distributed. We actually prefer the small size. So this is what's really interesting here, that in theory, originally, we now came to a point of we really wanted to just check jam. But because he's making a lot of passive mistakes against the non-all-in size here, we actually benefit from that. And when he does jam against this size, we now just basically call it off with every single hand. So we're never folding to the jam if he does jam. But because the smaller size generates additional calls from him that shouldn't call. So he's calling with any deuce, any gut shot. He's calling with any four. He's never folding a pair here. Because we're now getting additional value out of that, it's going to incentivize us to use this size. We don't want to necessarily stop him from making those mistakes by being passive here. We could still jam. The jam is still going to have value attached to it. And we haven't locked his range in full here. So maybe if we had him never folding a pair, we might be able to gain more value from the all-in. But this is greater than a 2x pot all-in. And we did say before, he never folds a pair to less than 2x pot, but above 2x pot, we don't really know. So in general here, even if we kind of attribute some frequency to calling off with bottom pair here, the all-in is not as valuable as the small raise, the 67% raise here. So we're definitely prioritizing that as one of our main tools to exploit Steve and his overall passiveness against that raise size. So in this spot, we saw that there were some flop donk bets existing at equilibrium against Steve's wide opening range. However, if Steve is always c-betting this board, we should check and let him make this mistake. Our check raise frequency if Steve range bets half pot is extremely high, mostly because our calls are going to under-realize their equity on a highly dynamic board texture. And a lot of our potential check raising hands are simply going to shove all in if they get 3-bet, or call off against the 3-bet shove. If we're a little bit shallower, a little bit deeper, there's going to be some slight variations there. One downside of check raising a lot here and taking advantage of Steve's continues is that since the board is highly dynamic, it's definitely going to be pretty tricky to play the turn here after we check raise. And we could consider using that larger check raise or the check jam as a counter to this. But of course, there is going to be a little bit of an EV sacrifice that comes along with forcing ourselves to check jam some hands, which might do better as a smaller raise to get value from that passiveness of Steve's. So this may not be an optimal approach. It might just be a practical simplification. And of course, if you are looking at getting better at these spots, I would recommend practicing them. Run them through GTO Wizard AI, run some node locks, put some trainer drills together, and give yourself a chance to get better at playing these spots. So this brings us back around to establishing an overall strategic framework for how we're going to crush Steve, even in a full ring environment. Against a maniac like Steve, the bulk of our EV comes from the earlier streets and from the fact that he's putting in far too much money with far too many hands. Our goal is to build pots with higher equity hands, even if those are some fairly thin value hands, and extract the maximum value at the top of our range. This is going to mean we use larger sizes and more linear ranges overall to maximize the amount of money we can get into the pot on the earlier streets while our equity is still high. Our goal here is to realize our own equity as much as possible, being all in pre-flop or on the flop if necessary, while denying Steve the chance to realize his equity, since a big part of the reason why his maniac style is a losing strategy is because most of the hands he plays aren't strong enough to realize enough equity against our range. If we play too passively against Steve and don't get enough money into the pot on the earlier streets, then we allow him to realize his equity more easily. We end up with more spots where he unexpectedly sucks out on the turn or river, or more spots where we simply can't get any value from a very good hand because he lands on the river with nothing which can pay us off. The exception here is when our hand's equity is highly robust. For example, if we flop a full house or another hand which is virtually invincible. In those instances, we might benefit from allowing Steve's extremely weak range to realize some more equity and pick up a hand which can pay us off to some extent. Finally, when it comes to post-flop play, if Steve is always going to bet when we check to him, we should not bet from out of position. Check raising should be a huge part of our strategy against him. When we're in position, we may want to have more checks in order to neutralize his ability to check raise at a higher frequency, but from out of position, our main source of EV is to allow him to put far too much money into the pot with too many hands. That about does it for this video. Thanks for sticking with me all the way through. If you have any questions, I'll be around in our Discord server to answer them. Otherwise, I'll be back soon with another video here on YouTube. Thanks for watching, everyone, and good luck at the tables.